All right. Hey folks, this is Dr. Surasingha with your second lecture topic on the biosphere. We are going to talk about different types of biomes in this particular lecture. So, what is biosphere first? Well, actually that's where you find all the forms of life on the planet Earth. Not all life forms on planet Earth are present throughout the earth. Okay, so there are certain areas where you find life. So the parts of the earth's surface, um, the water, the aquatic environments, and the atmosphere that is occupied by living organisms is what we meant by the biosphere. So biosphere is not a perfect circle. It has an irregular shape, um, and it's kind of a, compared to the entire volume of the planet earth, biosphere is kind of a thin layer, right? It's a thin zone within which life is concentrated on, right? Um, so this includes Earth's, like kind of the crust, the top of the surface, and all the most of the forms of water and inland waters and the oceans, right? And only a fraction of the overall planet's physical environment can support life, right? So most of the life is found within a smaller fraction of the physical environment of the planet Earth. So as you can see in this diagram, the part that's actually, um, the aquatic portion of the planet Earth is considered hydrosphere, right? And the gaseous component is the atmosphere, and the Earth's the solid surfaces, the soil, rocks, and all of that, right, is considered the lithosphere. Um, what is a biome? There are marine, freshwater, and terrestrial biomes. Areas sharing similar climate excuse me, areas sharing similar climatic conditions, topographic and soil conditions um, are collectively considered a single type of a biome. So areas that actually are similar in terms of the climate, topography, that's, what is topography? It's kind of a geographic variation, is also considered topography. Having the similar type of soil conditions tends to host similar types of biological communities. Um, so biomes can be also defined as large-scale biological communities that are influenced by a particular physical environment in which those biological communities are found, right? So a biome consists of a large volume of biological communities that interact with a particular physical environment. Biomes are physically extensive. They are large, right? They are spatially widespread. May be characterized by a certain type of a vegetation, a grassland type or a forest type. Biomes can occur across different continents, right? Continents that are further apart from each other by an ocean could still contain the same biome, right? Um, for example, the North American portion of the American continent and the Eurasian component can contain very similar species, very similar forest types, very similar grassland types, right? So because of that, North America and Europe and Eurasia, collectively share um, same types of biomes. Um, so biomes tend to have similar physical characteristics across different geographies, right? And because these physical characteristics conditions are similar within a biome, um, the evolutionary pressure exerted by the biome onto the biological community is going to be the same, right, within a particular biome. And as such, the evolutionary response observed or elicited by the organisms are also going to be similar within a given biome. So as a result, um, the different species may show same or similar adaptations when they inhabit a particular biome. Or in other words, different organisms with different evolutionary histories, different phylogenetic histories, if they are living in the same biome, will show similar adaptations. Um, so, organisms or species that do not share the same ancestry, right? When they don't share the same evolutionary history, right? Um, can be found on a given biome, right? So, because of that, right, although species occupying a particular biome are not necessarily closely related to each other, they could show similar adaptations. So members of a given biome, right, as such, could have similar morphological features, morphological characteristics, right? So that doesn't mean they're actually closely related. They just look similar because the evolution has shaped them to look similar, right? Because the adaptations the environment demands is going to be more or less the same, right? So the evolution, natural selection favors those similar body morphologies, similar body shapes, similar body sizes. That's the reason, right? So these are actually some of the global terrestrial biomes that you are going to study, right? So I'm going to show you different types of maps over here. Now I don't expect you to memorize specifically, right, the biomes you are looking at over here. Do I want you to memorize this very specific map in this great detail? Actually, no. The relative distribution of each biome, yes, right, like a very approximate knowledge about in what part of the world a particular biome is found. Is it closer to the equator? Is it further away from the equator? Is it closer to the poles? Is it further away from the poles? Like that, a relative um, knowledge, an approximate knowledge of the geographic presence is what I expect. I do not expect you to memorize these maps as it is. Okay, so keep that in your mind very well. Moving on, so and then again, as we go into each and individual biome, each and every biome that you are looking at over here, you will kind of try to, it will help you to remember the relative geographic location. But I do implore that do not try to strenuously memorize these maps. So let's first talk about terrestrial biomes, and first let's try to understand what are the critical environmental variables that contribute to formation of these biomes. So we talked about the latitudinal gradient of biodiversity very briefly during our first lecture, right? We mentioned that the biodiversity is high. There's a rich species assemblages at the tropics, and we also know that as you move towards the poles, the diversity declines, right? We very briefly touched based on how latitude impacts climate during the last lecture topic. So biome classification is largely based on what? Overwhelmingly, it is based on the growth form of the dominant vegetation. So growth form is, what do you mean by growth form? You know what vegetation, dominant vegetation is, right? Meaning what? Like, what is the most commonly found type of vegetation? What is growth form? Growth form refers to the gross morphology, the overall shape of a particular tree, particular type of a vegetation, and their relative size. Are they large, tall, or are they short and stunned, right? So based on the dominant vegetation forms, we can identify basically these three types: trees, shrubs, and grasses. And also another way you can classify terrestrial biomes is based on the leaf characteristics. Are they deciduous, right? Meaning what? Meaning, do those trees, vegetation, shed their leaves seasonally, right? Or are the leaves succulent? Meaning, like what? Are leaves juicy? Are they thick? Do they contain a lot of water? Persistence. Do the plants keep their leaves for a very long time in a year? Do they shed leaves at all, right? If they shed, is there a regrowth? Like, how long do trees actually become dormant without presence of leaves? So all of that refers to leaf characteristics. So why are we using vegetation to classify biomes, right? Why not Why can't we use animals? Animals are cute and cuddly. Well, the problem is animals are mobile, right? They move a lot. They range here and there. So it's hard to define a biome based on animals. I mean, we know that many bird species migrate, right? So how do we define a particular biome if we consider the entire range occupied by a particular species for their lifetime, right? I mean, even certain insects migrate, right? So it makes, and certain bats, certain mammals migrate. So it's across different environments. So it's difficult and scientifically inaccurate to consider animals as a proxy, as an agent to delineate biomes. So plants are actually, the plant responses to changes in the physical environment is actually easier to measure, because since plants cannot move around, dislodging themselves from their current location is not an option. Animals can do that. Animals can move around. They can hunker down, right? They can disappear. They can leave a particular habitat. Plants cannot. So the evolutionary responses are less behavioral, more morphological and physiological in a plant. Now, don't get me wrong, animals do have morphological, non-behavioral adaptations such as physiology, biochemical, and morphological and anatomical. But animals do move a lot, so that kind of makes it harder um, to understand biomes in terms of animal responses, right? So, and plant responses to biological pressure such as competition is easy to measure, right? Again, the reason being they cannot move around, right? It makes it's more like a logistic reason why we don't use animals, right, as a means of classifying biomes. And so global distribution of terrestrial biomes, right, are actually, as you see in this figure, are determined based on temperature and precipitation, average annual temperature and average annual precipitation, right? So if you look at this figure, right, I mean, we will roughly try to understand, how to interpret this figure. Environments that receive a very high, extremely high level of average annual precipitation while sustaining relatively high annual temperatures are classified as tropical rainforests. Areas that receive very low annual average precipitation, right, that also undergo extremely high fluctuations of annual average temperature are going to be deserts, right? Areas that actually receive relatively low annual rainfall but maintain extremely low temperatures are going to be tundra, right? So like that, you can actually reasonably classify terrestrial biomes based on vegetation, um, by investigating average annual precipitation and average annual temperature, right? And why temperature and precipitation seem to have such a dramatic influence on global biomes? The reason is, plant physiology, right? Plants' growth, their reproduction are dependent on water availability, right? The plant's ability to collect and gather nutrient, right? So all of those are influenced by either temperature or precipitation, right? Precipitation increases the water availability, right, for growth, for physiology, for nutrient absorption, right, for transpiration, to redistribute photosynthetic goods, right? Water is required for photosynthesis, right? And temperature is required for any biomolecular biochemical function, for any enzymatic reaction. Temperature is required. So that is actually why temperature and precipitation seem to be the critical drivers of global biome distribution. Now let's move into different types of biomes and try to understand the biological features of those locations. Now, tropical rainforests are arguably my favorite biome, right? I mean, I grew up in tropical rainforest environments. I started my research career, my academic background in tropical rainforests. I still do research in tropical rainforests, right? An overwhelming proportion of research I conduct, um, publications I produce, papers I write targets tropical rainforests. So I have a personal bias towards this habitat. So, meaning I'm going to talk a lot more about these habitats. Um, so Where do you find tropical rainforests? Low latitudes, right? It's roughly around 10 degrees north and 10 degrees south of the equator, right? So lower latitudes. The map shows where it is. Annual average precipitation is, is usually over 2,000 millimeters, right? That's a lot of rain, okay? And rain is uniformly distributed. Rainfall is uniformly distributed evenly throughout the year. And I can reasonably say rainfall instead of precipitation because tropical rainforests do not receive snowfall or ice storms. It's quite a rare event if it does. So that's why I am, like not reluctant to use the word rainfall in this particular case. Um, Let me actually get my pointer. I need to point certain things out in this particular figure, right? If you look at the figure with me right now, it shows temperature on this axis, the time, and the precipitation on these three axes, right? So first, look how nearly uniform the temperature is, right? It fluctuates between like 25 to 30 degrees, right? But it stays very uniform throughout the year, right? That's seasonal temperature changes, right? There is no temperature change across different months. So as such, you will not experience any monthly rhythms, no seasonal rhythms, so to speak. If you look at the rainfall part of that particular figure, right, you can clearly see, right, the dark blue part in that figure represents um, the excess water, right, water that actually like remains in tropical rainforests after evapotranspiration takes place. So you are looking at actually kind of there's ample evidence for moisture surplus, water precipitation surplus, because the supply of water through precipitation through rainfall is far greater than what is lost through evaporation and evapotranspiration. It's really cool, right, to understand, to think about that fact. Um, and remember, if you can remember from my earlier lectures, we talked about this intertropical convergence zone. It is a zone that actually keep receiving ample amount of precipitation by rising and falling air masses. The warm air masses that rises up from the equator, moves gradually away from the equator and then falls back. Well, that intertropical convergence zone is actually where you find these tropical rainforests. Um, because of the aseasonal nature, because of the uniform year-round temperature, because of the surplus moisture, you are going to have continuous aseasonal plant growth. You will not see a growth season, right? Because a plant can grow any day of the year, because the temperature favors that. Um, Extremely productive ecosystems on the planet, one of the most productive ecosystems, right? And because of the high productivity, the uniform temperature, moisture surplus, tropical rainforests are also extremely high in biodiversity, right? So what is productivity? Well, this is not an environmental science class, but I want you to know what productivity is. Productivity is actually the total biomass, right, produced within that particular ecosystem, initiated by photosynthesis, initiated by the plant's photosynthesis. The overall total biomass produced by a particular ecosystem is what productivity is, right? Now, about 10% of the the in terms of the entire surface area, right, of the planet Earth, um, tropical rainforests only account for a very small fraction of the Earth's surface, but within tropical rainforests, you find over 50% of the world's animal forms, right? Animal species and plant species, right? Over 50% of plant and animal species at global scale are found in tropical rainforests. To be a little bit more precise, some of those, right, uh, plants and animals are actually endemic to tropical rainforests, meaning they are only found within tropical rainforests. Another cool characteristics of tropical rainforests is the canopy structure. Canopy is thick and continuous, right? And those canopy trees actually grow very tall, right? Sometimes certain trees could actually reach up to 100 feet in height, right? On top of that, there are certain trees that actually shoots off the canopy, right? And we call that the super canopy, right? And so those trees can actually grow about 150, 160 feet in height. So that's an example how a tropical rainforest canopy looks like. It's thick, it's continuous, right? So it's so thick and continuous. The sunlight penetration to the bottom of the tropical rainforest is actually very rare. Now, before actually I need to mention something with regard to these biomes. Since this topic is so much interesting, I'm going to upload several video links to the lectures, right? I'm not going to spend time playing it right now, right? But I'm going to upload those links to Blackboard, and they are already actually there in Blackboard. But I will bring all of those under one place so you can watch them. And watching those videos is required. Those are very short, like 3 minutes, less than 4 minute videos. So do take a look at them. Now, amphibian life is actually quite unique in tropical rainforests. Reptilians and amphibians are known to be exceptionally diverse in tropical rainforests. In fact, I'm going to talk about a couple of species that actually I have studied. I continue to study up to date. This guy is actually is a bush frog, right? When you think about amphibians, right, you might think about those that live in water, right? In this particular part of the world, right, in temperate world, yeah, that is actually quite true. Amphibians are largely aquatic. There's only few terrestrial forms. But this guy is actually a tree frog, right? They don't live in water, right? They actually live on trees, right, in shrub layers, right? And speaking of which, do they live in the tree canopy? Chances are they do, but the tree canopy of tropical rainforests are largely understudied, right? And so these guys actually make nests, right? When they reproduce, when they actually mate, after mating, they actually make a nest on the tree, right? And the tadpole development completely happens inside that particular nest, right? And in certain species, actually, after a certain stage of development, those tadpoles actually rupture the nest and jump into water, right below the tree. There's ample amount of water, right, on the forest floor. So actually, the risk of nests drying is very low. And certain species of bush frogs occupying tropical rainforests do not even have a larval stage. It's really funny. There's plenty of water, right, in tropical rainforests. Perennial supply of water, year-round supply of water, but still, certain amphibians have evolved to completely skip the larval stage, right? So those life cycles of those amphibians could be virtually independent of water. This guy, right, that you found in the bottom, it's actually a freshwater crab. It's actually an arboreal crab that actually diverged from freshwater crab lineages. That guy only reproduces in water containing tree cavities in tropical rainforests. They don't breed anywhere else. It's really funny, right? You are looking at those large mature trees in tropical rainforests, right? They actually have those huge tree cavities, right? I'm not talking about dead trees. No, I'm talking about live trees, right? And they collect water because of the ample precipitation, and these guys actually have evolved in such a way to breed in those very unique environments. I'm going to talk a little bit more about really cool species that are endemic to tropical rainforests. This guy is actually Sri Lankan kangaroo lizard. It's called a kangaroo lizard because it actually can run bipedally, right? It is so good at running bipedally, it can, actually run on water without actually sinking into water, right? It's pretty amazing how they can do it. And I have seen them doing that not only on still water, but even on running water, right? It's actually extremely bizarre. Now, that guy is not a different species of lizards, right? It's actually this is the male species, right? And this is the female species, right, of the Sri Lankan kangaroo lizard. So these particular weird structures, you see this particular crest and this sac, right, is actually for the purpose of sexual dimorphism, right? So when a male has a huge crest, right, and this huge oral sac, right, that actually attracts more females. That guy is called hump-nosed lizard because its nose has a hump in it, right? Another really cool species of lizard that is endemic to rainforest environments. And these guys, right, these kangaroo lizards are forest floor specialists. These guys are arboreal, right? They, on a given day, they actually climb up and down the tree, right? And while they do that, they actually hunt. That's the primary purpose for these up and down daily movements. And they are very territorial. You usually find them on the same general area, and the male and female tend to have, relatively permanent pair bonding. And that is actually a snake. It's also an arboreal snake. So it's really cool that, when you have such a very, very lush tree growth, right? So much animals adopt to occupy niches created by trees, right? When you look at the temperate world, here in North America, snakes mostly live on the ground, right? But these guys actually live on trees. Actually, there's a whole suite of snakes that are actually occupying arboreal habitats, arboreal niches, right? And this guy is called the green pit viper, right? So it's actually a viper, a pit viper, that is living arboreally. And it's really cool what these guys eat. They're not only can they climb trees, not only they can actually navigate very successfully in very thin branches, as you can see in this particular photograph, right? They can even actually climb vertical surfaces like rock surfaces, right? And I have actually seen these guys hunting for bats in caves and hunting for bats on trees, right? Now that is actually another really cool species that I study currently. These are called horned lizards, right? Why are they called horned lizard? Look at this particular thing. It's a horn, right? Now, this particular horn is actually used for probably for two purposes. We are actually trying to understand, through our current research, what the actual purpose is. Seems like for certain species, it is actually, much more larger in male and virtually absent in female, right? So for that case, we suspect, we believe that the purpose of that particular horn is actually to attract mates. In fact, in those species, the actual rostral appendage grows faster than the rest of the body, right? So, in fact, if you look at a male and a female, right, without the length of the horn, right, the male is actually smaller and shorter than a female of the same age, right? So, the greater the disproportionateness between the rostral appendage and the body, right, the better chance that particular male has to attract a female. It's really weird if you think about it. The weirder the look on the male, right, better it appeals to a female. Okay, like a girl liking a weird looking guy, that's exactly what's happening over here. And for certain other species, we believe that actually, well, more than a belief, we actually have evidence to suggest that the horn actually helps them to camouflage, right? It's kind of, if you look at, some of those lizards, they look like a twig. They don't like an animal. They look like a piece of a bark of a tree, right? So that helps them to camouflage better in particular environments, right? And also I have noticed that for other species of horned lizards, they actually move their horn up and down in very beautiful patterns when they're actually doing male to male combats, particularly not physical combat, but when they do male versus male displays, right? Particularly when they're defending their territories or when they're showing off in front of a girl, right? Some of them actually make these really beautiful movements with their horns, right? And the horns are movable. The last part, actually, I should have talked a lot more. I can talk a lot more about the insect lives or the invertebrate lives of tropical rainforests. Over there, you are looking at stick insects, right? The big one is the male, the tiny one is the female, right? So that's actually, they are sexually dimorphic, right? And there are lots of interesting stories to talk about stick insects, right? I mean, you might also, can assume by the vastly different sizes. So after they mate, in this one, they're actually quite ready to mate, right? If the mating was successful, the male has a very little chance of getting away alive, right? Most often after copulation, after the male injects sperms, the female will actually start eating the male. Um, Another group of species that is extremely important and unique to tropical rainforests are non-human primates, right? And here we are looking at actually not any primate, we are specifically looking at great apes, right? Orangutan and chimpanzees, right? And chimpanzees are endemic to tropical rainforests of Central Africa, and orangutan occur in tropical rainforests of Borneo, right? So those are really cool, arboreal primates that have well adapted for arboreal mode of lives, right? Again, a unique feature that you can only observe in tropical rainforests. Um, so tropical rainforests have broad leaves, right? And they are evergreen. They do not change color. Um, so because of the thick canopy, the continuous canopy, light is a limiting factor, right, to the forest flow. Um, because of that, if a particular vegetation, a particular plant species is not a tree that cannot grow taller, right, they have to find another way to actually reach the top of the tree, so that they can intercept sunlight. So because of that, there are so many lianas, vines, that actually have evolved to actually wrap around tree trunks and rise all the way to the top of the canopy to intercept solar radiation, right? Um, and the second part is actually epiphytes, right? So that's an example for liana. You can actually see the host tree is almost invisible, right? There are huge, a thick vine, a liana, right, wrapping around the host tree, trying to get to the top of the canopy. Epiphytes. I mean, you might have heard about orchids, right? And you may also know that most orchids grow on another tree because those are epiphytes. Not all orchids are epiphytes, but most orchids are, right? So epiphytes are trees that grow on another tree. Epiphytes are not parasites, right? Epiphytes have green leaves, right? This actually has red leaves, but this guy has green leaves. So they can actually photosynthesize, right? So what they do is actually, since there's very small plants, they don't have a woody stem, so they cannot grow tall. They are very short plants. So only way they can intercept sunlight is if they start growing on a canopy, on another tree, right? So what they do is actually, when the seeds start to germinate, they actually create a root system. That actually root system kind of remains on the dead part of the host tree, right? It accumulates soil by collecting the dead leaves or the bark that peels off the tree, right? And creates a root system on the dead organic matter of a particular host tree, and it starts leafing out, right? Um, because the sunlight penetration to the forest floor in tropical rainforests are so poor, the understory growth in a tropical rainforest is also very poor, right? You can actually easily walk through a tropical rainforest floor, right, with very little impedance. Mm. So one last point I want to show is actually this is the canopy component, right? And there are few trees that actually emerge away from the canopy. I don't that part is not very clearly shown over here. So this is the actual canopy, right? And then right underneath the canopy you can have kind of a lower, like a secondary canopy, but the actual understory, right, if present, is very sparse, right? um the last but not the least is actually about what else you find on the forest floor, right? So rainforest floor, right, I mean, if we were doing this particular thing in the class, I would actually ask you this question. Rainforest soil is actually nutrient poor, right? And it's very thin and it's quite acidic. Why? Right? And if rainforests have very nutrient poor soil, how can they maintain so much biodiversity? Those are the two, questions that I'm going to ask you. Well, since you are not in front of me, I'm going to give you the answer right now. Tropical rainforests are one of the most oldest biomes on the planet, right? And it contains a lot of dead organic matter, right? When dead organic matter further undergo decomposition, it releases acids. So that's why tropical rainforest flow can be acidic, right? Why it is thin? Because the continuous supply of water, rainfall, can actually lead to significant level of erosion. So that's why it's quite thin. Nutrient poor. Why? Well, because there is such a lush growth of vegetation. There's a lot of biodiversity. The temperature is high, moisture availability is high, so the metabolic activities are quite fast. The growth is fast. So the nutrient that is generated in the forest floor is quickly absorbed by the vegetation. So in a given moment, forest floor is quite nutrient poor, right? So that is actually the answer to the question. Another thing I wanted to kind of point out is that tropical rainforest flow, because of the accumulation of rich dead organic matter, provides ample habitats for a diverse array of fungi and molds, right? Just wanted to point that out. Let me get back to the point where I wanted to go. Yeah, there we are. Okay, here we go. So the next, the other type of biome I want to talk about is tropical seasonal forests and savannas. They are geographically found closer to the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, that is located around 23.5 degrees north and south latitudes, right? Still tropical biomes. Rainforest is now quite seasonal, they are not uniform. So because of that, you get distinct wet and dry seasons. The temperature still is uniform and high and year round. Because of the seasonality of rainfall, the vegetation don't grow tall and thick and high like you observed in the tropical rainforests. So still the tree density could be quite high, and trees usually exist as scrubs. The density of the grasses and scrubs are even higher than that of the trees. Actually, trees can occur, right? Trees are not absent, but they are sparse. They are here and there, right? They could be like kind of sparsely distributed, speckled across the landscape. What fills in the gap between trees are actually shrubs and grasses. Drought deciduous. Why? Because, well, you know what deciduous is shedding leaves. Drought deciduous is shedding leaves during the drought period. Why? Because during the periods where this biome do not receive rainfall, right, in order to save their lives, the trees actually had to become dormant, become inactive. So what they do is they shed their leaves, cut off evapotranspiration, right, and thereby save water and become dormant. Because of the seasonal weather, because of this rainfall seasonality, plus the deciduousness contributes to fire, right? So extreme dry conditions, the more extreme and more prolonged the drought conditions are, right, the greater the chance for fire. And by the way, that's not unnatural, that is fairly natural. In fact, these ecosystems are heavily dependent on fire, right? So these forests and savannas can actually remain dry for most of the year, right? And during the monsoon period, what happens with the onset of the rainfall, the same landscape can completely become something like that. So because of the deciduous nature and fire, the soil of tropical seasonal forests are quite rich in nutrients. Because of that, those are actually highly productive, highly useful for agricultural activities, right? But because of the same reason, agriculture is one of the biggest threats to tropical seasonal forests. Now, location of the tropical seasonal forests, as you can see, you can find them around those particular latitudes I mentioned to you, right? And the recurrent fire I explained to you, combined with grazing pressure, right? Because if these grasslands if these biomes actually have lots of scrubs and grasses, that will attract a lot of grazing herbivores, grazing mammals, right? Mammals that feed on vegetation. Collectively, fire and grazing pressure exerts a particular ecological disturbance and keeps this grasslands as a grassland, right? It prevents establishment of woodlands and vegetation. And in fact, as a counter adaptation to herbivory, some of the vegetation in tropical savannas or tropical woodlands, seasonal woodlands, actually have evolved thorns, right? That prevents their leaves and their biomass being eaten, right? And you can clearly see the seasonality that I explained earlier in both figures, right? You can see that the temperature is rather uniform in both of those habitats, right? But the rainfall is quite seasonal. In Brazilian environment, you can see a clear decline or a drought towards the middle of the year. In contrast, you can see the opposite pattern in the African tropical seasonal biomes, right? Um, that in this case, dry conditions towards the beginning and the end of the year, but in the middle few months, you can see remarkably high precipitation that is brought about by monsoon for monsoon rain. And these monsoon rains are quite torrential in these environments, right? So here you are looking at some cerrados of South America, well studied, highly diverse, biodiversity rich landscapes. It's more like a grassland, as you can see. In contrast, the central Australian tropical seasonal biomes are more like woodlands. Now let's talk about another biome, deserts. Very sparse in terms of plant life and animal life, right? Relatively lower in diversity, lower in density. The rainfall they receive is quite low. So, and since these environments sustain a very high annual temperature, right, they also sustain very low rainfall. So because of that, these environments are moisture deprived, right? Water is one of the most critical resources in desert habitats. The temperature can fluctuate between different seasons, within a season, even on a daily basis, right? For example, in temperate deserts, the maximum temperature can go as much as 50 degrees Celsius, right? Best examples could be taken from these North American deserts that you found in the western and the central part of the country. Sometimes temperature on a daily basis can fluctuate from anywhere over 30 degrees during daytime and anywhere around 10 degrees during nighttime. In temperate deserts during winter, temperature can drop below zero. The location of deserts mostly are found within subtropical latitudes at 30 degrees north and south of the equator, right? Well, largely north of the equator rather than south of the equator. So the reason is, like, what is the reason? Well, if you remember my lecture on the movement of air currents, right, across the planet, right? So in these particular subtropical latitudes, as you can remember, or you should remember, dry pockets of air that are deprived of moisture keeps descending, right? These descending dry air pockets creates a high pressure. Because of the high pressure at the surface of the earth or at these latitudes, these air masses, after absorbing moisture from the earth, cannot rise up. Because of that, cloud formation does not happen, right? Because of that, there is no rainfall. The higher temperatures also lead to high evaporative water loss, right, which also enhances the moisture deprivation. The rainfall could be limited to a few weeks, couple of weeks, maybe a month at best, sometimes even less, right? Sometimes could be just a few days. So as such, the plants and animals have to complete their life cycle during such a short time frame, right? Sometimes the reproduction window in desert environments for plants and animals has to happen during that shorter time frame. Before we go there, I want you to compare and take a look at these two figures, right? This is more like a tropical rainforest biome, right? This is a tropical biome, and this one is actually a temperate desert, right? See how high the rainfall is in this Central African biome, tropical Central African biome, and look at this temperate desert biome, right? The rainfall, barely reaches 25 millimeters per year, right? Temperature in this tropical biome was rather uniform and relatively high and stable. In the temperate desert, right, temperature varies, right, dropping to zero towards the winter months, and in the summer months, right, it actually well exceeds 20 degrees, right, and that could happen on a daily basis, right. So what you're looking at over here is the monthly mean temperatures, right, and clearly, in certain cases, sometimes in certain desert environments, the actual monthly fluctuations could be a lot dramatic than what you see in this particular graph. Right, now let's move on. So in desert environments, there's a water scarcity. Water is limited for biological activities. So that water limitation becomes an environmental pressure, environmental constraint. Now that kind of an environmental stress demands evolutionary adaptations, right? So adaptations comes with a cost. Adaptations are not common within the biological world. So adaptations are, in other words, rare, right? So as a result, the actual abundance of plant and animal lives in desert environments are quite low, right? And interestingly enough, in desert biomes, whatever the few life forms that are left, right, that are adapted, show similar adaptations. Their form, their shape, their sizes are very similar, right? And their functions, their physiology is quite similar. What are we looking at here? Different species, different life forms with different evolutionary histories are converging in terms of adaptations, in terms of morphological adaptations, in terms of physiological and functional adaptations. That phenomena is called convergent evolution. What is convergent evolution? Convergent evolution is a situation where species that are not closely related to each other, when they occupy a similar the same environment, when they are encountered with the same evolutionary pressure, right, the evolution trajectory pushes them towards very similar morphologies, very similar functions. That's what convergent evolution is. So convergent evolution kind of drives the evolution of desert plant lives. A, to increase water storage. B, to create succulent stems and leaves, right, to store water. To create waxy coatings, waxy cuticles around the plant body to prevent evaporative water loss, right? To replace the actual leaves with small needle-like projections, right? Even physiologically, right? These plants actually have switched their photosynthetic mechanism from regular photosynthesis that you see in C3 or C4 to CAM photosynthesis. I'm not going to go into detail about the photosynthesis. I can, but that's something you will learn later in cell biology or in plant physiology, right? So what happens in CAM photosynthesis simply is it helps to do photosynthesis during the night time without risking dehydration or being subjected to heat stress. And if you look at some of these plants, these examples, right, cactus and euphorbes are completely two different plant lives, right? They are not related at all. Their phylogenies are quite unrelated, but they look like the same, right? And cactus is actually more like North American, right? North American and South American. Euphorbes are more like African. Right, and some euphorbes actually, I believe, also occur in other parts of the old world, but cactus is rather new world. And these are a couple of examples, right, of different types of desert plant lives, right? So now you can see, right, these tiny needles, those thorns are actually leaves, right? Cacti and euphobe leaves. So actually this particular part, the green part, is not the leaves, it's actually the stem, right? The reason why needles are so tiny and so residual is because when needles are so small, right, the number of stomata in the leaves are also going down, right? And in fact, I suspect there are any stomata in those leaves, right? In those needles, in those tiny thorns. So that actually prevents water loss, right? Tree trunks do not have stomata, so there is very little risk of water loss, right? By pushing or by kind of evolving the stem to photosynthetic activities, right? Now leaves are performing what function? Protective function. Those thorns prevent these plants being eaten up by herbivores, right? It prevents herbivory damage. So leaves are taking a protective function, stems are taking over the photosynthetic function. Folded stems. So the stems are actually folded. The reason is actually that kind of creates this like ridge and valley kind of a surface that further limits and prevents water loss from the plant surface. And particularly that kind of morphology protects the plant body, kind of protect the plant body from harmful UV radiation. And UV radiation, it can actually damage at high energy levels, can damage plant tissues, particularly can damage photosynthetic organs, right? So this kind of foldings of the stem actually creates something called the shelf shading. So it actually prevents overheating of the plant, or being damaged by high energy UV radiation, right? And in fact, if there are stomatas at all, those stomatas are located in these deep furrows of the folded stem, right? So which also minimizes the water loss. Well, I should not let you believe that deserts are completely lifeless. That's not true at all, right? Deserts have interesting life forms, particularly the reptilian life forms are quite rich in desert environments, right? I mean, in this one, you are looking at this desert sidewinder who's very well adapted to camouflage and kind of blend into the desert environments, right? And in fact, some of those desert snakes, they can actually kind of dig themselves into the sand and hide in the sand, and sit and wait in search of predators, right? And then and also these guys are actually quite venomous, by the way, right? And it's actually, as you can see, desert sidewinders are rattlesnakes. And also sidewinders move by throwing winds, like kind of uh, in their body rather than like slithering. The reason for that is actually by kind of slithering, like kind of winding over the desert sand, they minimize the contact with their body and the hot desert sand, which also protects them from actually kind of their from tissues from burning. But then you might ask the question, okay, how come that they survive when they actually kind of dig into the sand? So in desert environment, the surface is hotter than the interior, right? That's why it's perfectly okay for a desert sidewinder to dig into the sand and hide in the sand and sit and wait for hours waiting for a prey, okay? On the bottom, you are looking at horny toad. It's not a toad, it's actually a lizard, right? So these guys are actually anteaters, right? They are specialized anteaters. The problem if you are eating ants is actually that ants can eat you back. They can attack you back. They can mount a unified attack on you. So the evolutionary pathway the horny toad has taken is actually, it has a thick body armor around itself, which actually prevents its protects it from being attacked by ants while it is eating ants, right? And also they are perfectly capable of absorbing moisture through their skin, right? Despite they're having such a thick skin, there are specific grooves in their like belly, right? If there's some moisture on the desert, right, they can actually kind of make direct contact with the surface of the desert and absorb that moisture directly through their skin, and through capillary action, that absorbed moisture can actually move towards their mouth. And there's a video that actually on Blackboard that explains this phenomena in great detail. The last part, not the last part, another animal that I want to talk about is actually desert scorpions. So one of the coolest part about these desert scorpions is actually, right, one of their best survival strategy is actually by eating their own kind. Okay, so they frequently fight with their own species, and if they kill the other one, they eat the other guy, right? And they're highly venomous, right? In desert environments, when you are coming across a particular prey, you cannot lose the battle with the prey, right? That's why they have become so venomous, right? And I also believe the cannibalistic behavior, eating its own kind, could also be one is actually, the best way to survive in a harsh environment is to eat your own kind. Then in that way you actually get all the nourishments, all the nutrients you require to survive, right? Now, don't take my word seriously, and actually if you're hungry, don't do anything to your roommate, right? That's what animals do. Well, I know we are animals, but don't do it. In terms of plant lives, we cannot ignore the plant lives either, because on one hand, the prickly pear cactus is actually one of the most nutrient rich, moisture rich food source available for wildlife in desert environments, right? And some of those cacti, like saguaro cactus, actually, kind of assume the morphology of a tree, right? And actually there are so many cavity nesting birds, right, using those trees, as a refuge. So In terms of desert environments, Sonoran Desert in southwestern United States or southwestern North America is one of the most diversity-rich deserts. There are about 200 species of animals currently recorded from Sonoran Desert. Um, so in this figure, I'm also going over several other important animal lives found in desert environments. On the top figure, you are looking at Namib Desert, that is located in Namibia. It's a country located in southwestern Africa. That desert is located on the westernmost coast, right? One of the largest global lion populations occur in the Namib Desert, right? And lions are actually like threatened; they are endangered, at global scale. But that particular population is doing great. The bottom figure again, we are looking at the same desert, Namib Desert. This is Welwitschia. It's a really cool plant, right? It's evolutionarily unique. There are only like 2 species of that particular kind, right? That is endemic to the Namib Desert, right? They don't actually grow into trees. They actually have like they only produce like 2 leaves, right? But what happens is those leaves are very long and they break along the length and kind of breaks up into those pieces. And also, the Welwitschia male and female plants occur separately. And another cool fact is, these are coastal deserts. So coastal deserts gets a good supply of moisture through the coastal winds or by the oceanic waves. So these plants can actually trap the moisture in the ocean currents and actually condense water and absorb that particular water for their own survival. Um, this is actually a wedge-snouted sand lizard, but it's a sit and wait predator. Because the desert sand can be extremely hot, it actually, in order to prevent it getting literally burnt by the hot sand, it's actually doing this yoga thingy, right? It's actually kind of, like bringing its tail up, lifting its limbs up, and so it's just belly is touching the ground, right? And also they are quite sensitive to any movement on the sand. So if there's any insect burrowing through, like they can actually sense it. In this last image, I want to show you this, sand dunes that actually are highly dynamic systems. The vegetation recruitment happens on the sand dunes, although they are quite unstable. And look at this poor oryx. So generally, the wildlife, particularly, this is again, these photographs are actually from African or southern African deserts, right? Southern African deserts are quite diverse, right? Particularly in terms of mammalian and reptilian life. So this one actually I'm not going to spend way too much time on. I want you to figure out like why, what are the impacts of agriculture and livestock grazing in desert habitats or desert environments. Well, rather than me giving you answers to all the questions, I am going to challenge you to find your own answer for that particular question. Okay, let's move on to another biome. Temperate grassland biome, found mostly between 30 to 50 degrees north in the northern hemisphere, right? You can see in the map, most of the grasslands are in the northern hemisphere, northern temperate part, few in the southern temperate part. So the vegetation is mostly grasses, right, and seasonal herbs, and a few beautiful flowering plants. And I should not disregard the flowering plants that you find in desert in grassland environments. I'm trying to get my pointer here. There we go. There's greater seasonal variation in both temperature and precipitation in temperate grasslands. And now remember, since we are looking at the temperate environments, precipitation can be both snow and rain. There's an increasing duration of sub-freezing temperature that these grasslands experience, particularly towards the northern and southern poles, right? And you can actually see at the southern pole there are lots of grasslands, right? That is kind of fringing towards the south pole, right? The same thing over here, right? So during summer time in temperate grasslands, you tend to get a lot of moisture, right? Because the rain occurs during summer, and also the temperature is actually relatively higher, right, during summer. The winter is on the opposite spectrum. They are cold and dry. So meaning like although you receive snowfall, ample amount of snowfall to these temperate grasslands, the snow melt takes a longer time. So that snow is not really available for plant life. So that's why I mentioned cold and dry, right? And cold because sometimes when the winter starts, right? Even before the winter, they actually hit 0 degrees. So sub-freezing conditions can prevail for months in temperate grassland environments. Um, it's kind of important for you to know where you find in North America the grassland. It's kind of in the middle of the country. The Great Plains, right? The prairies, tall grass prairies, short grass prairies, mixed grass prairies, all of those are examples for grassland environments. And then actually there is some central Andean grasslands, right? Steppes in the Patagonia, like in the southernmost tip of South America. Pampas and Campos, right? Those are also like very well known grasslands that's in the South American realm. And then some grasslands also occur in South Africa. Those South African grasslands are quite rich in diversity, right? And then steppes grasslands that occur towards the Central Asian environments, right? There are different types of steppes that you find over there. And then of course some patches of grassland in Australia as well. In fact, these grasslands kind of have a long history because those grasslands actually have associated human activities for a very long time. In North America, those grasslands have a long human history, human disturbances, particularly with the Indian tribes, right, with the Native Americans. So at least in North America, well, actually not in North America, particularly not just in North America, right? Even if you go to other continents, the humans' evolutionary history actually is strongly connected to the grassland environments because grasslands are good areas, productive areas for farming, for hunting, right? So those environments have long interacted with the humans. Okay. I mentioned about the warm, moist summer versus cold, dry winter. So fire and grazing pressure, are actually quite prevalent in um, the temperate grassland environments. Because of the seasonal fire and grazing, it prevents establishment of trees. So grasslands remain as grasslands and it kind of prevents the succession from happening, right? Seasonal fire and seasonal grazing will prevent establishment of trees, right? So I did talk about several examples already with you. And yes, so they're actually distributed, throughout different continents. So this actually brings back a point I mentioned very early, right? Biomes are not restricted to a particular continent. So in this example, grasslands are found in almost every continent except Antarctica. So another cool fact about temperate grasslands is something to do with their root systems. Temperate grassland vegetation have very deep and extensive root systems that are well adapted to survive hot summer, that are well adapted to survive cold, frigid winter, right? That are well adapted to survive summer fire, right? Or fall fire that can happen, right? So those plants are annual plants, meaning what? They actually blossom every year. They produce above ground biomass, produce seeds, they die. Seeds adds on to the soil and then germinate back in the following season. So because of this repeated above ground biomass dying and fire in combination creates actually a very rich soil that is very rich in organic matter, right? So temperate grassland soil is quite suitable for farming activities. In this figure, actually, you are looking at the temperature seasonality and rainfall seasonality in temperate grassland habitats, and you can see in this one, right, at the beginning and the end of the year you are actually getting lower temperatures and lower precipitation, but in the middle of the year you are actually getting the peak of the precipitation as well as peak of the rainfall. That's actually good, right? When you have the highest possible temperature, you're also having the greatest moisture availability. That actually helps, that actually triggers better plant growth, that actually enhances biological activities in general. It increases biological productivity in general. So the kind of land use that predominates temperate grasslands are actually animal farming, grazing, right, herding, and lots of agriculture. Needless to say that most of the agriculture in the United States happens in the middle of the country. That's because the soil conditions are favorable for them. Think about those states that are well known for corn farms, corn fields, right? Those used to be actually grasslands. And in fact, which brings about a really cool conservation point. I'm a conservation biologist in terms of my research interests and in terms of my specialization, right? So the biggest threat to North American grasslands are actually agriculture, right? Well, I'm not going to go too much into that because we are talking about ecology, not about conservation. Okay, let's move on to talk about a another type of a biome, temperate scrublands and woodlands. So those temperate scrublands and woodlands occur again in northern latitudes between 30 to 40 degrees, and you can actually see some examples of those locations in the map. So some of those temperate scrublands and woodlands, belong to the Mediterranean climate. In fact, my map overwhelmingly focuses on those Mediterranean type temperate scrublands and woodlands. In these areas, actually, the Mediterranean climate creates a very interesting environmental pressure, biologically speaking, right? So the temperate scrublands and woodlands are found under Mediterranean climate. Those habitats, those biomes are found also in continental interior, particularly continental areas that are actually protected by mountains. That's what I mean by rain shadows, right? And these areas actually also undergo very dramatic seasonal changes, right? And the temperate woodland types, right, usually in terms of their habitat characteristics, they have an open canopy. There are tree growth, but trees are short, right? They are smaller, right? Most of the vegetation is actually not tree-like. Temperate shrublands predominantly have scrub type vegetation, which are actually much dwarf, right? They are short in vegetation height. The winter brings about rain, right? So they have wintry rains, meaning cold rains, right? And the spring is actually relatively hot and dry, so moisture deprived, right? And the same thing regarding summer and fall, right? So summer, fall, and spring tends to be warm, hot, but also dry, less moisture, right? So temperature might be favorable for growth, for biological activities, but there's less moisture. In winter, well, there's enough rainfall, enough moisture, but the temperature is too low. So that mismatch between peak water availability and optimal temperature creates something called growth asynchrony, right? So growing season, right, the climatically favorable growth season does not match with rain. That's what happens in these temperate scrublands and woodlands. So the vegetation you find in these environments are actually evergreen, right? The trees and shrubs are evergreen. Why? Well, they cannot now afford to be deciduous. Why? So they have to actually, during winter, they have to stay awake. They cannot go dormant. They cannot shed their leaves. Despite the cold weather, they have to accumulate and absorb moisture, right? Store that moisture during winter, and then during summer, right, use that moisture for metabolic activities, for photosynthesis, because now the temperature is favorable to carry out those activities, right? So because of that, these evergreen shrubs and trees are able to continue their biological activities, their metabolic activities throughout seasons, during cold wet periods, as well as dry, hot periods. So this is actually also brings another advantage. The problem that we have in deciduous environments is that resprouting of the vegetation demands a lot of nutrients, right? Since these guys in temperate scrublands and woodlands are evergreen, they retain their leaves, right? So they don't have to actually think about gaining back nutrients, right? Nutrient demand is not a problem. They actually keep nutrients locked in the plant body, right? So it's kind of brings them an evolutionary advantage. Characteristics of their plants, another characteristics of this vegetation is sclerophyllous leaves. So meaning those leaves are leather-like, they are tough, right? It's hard to bend or break them. They are stiff, right? Herbivores or other animals cannot easily eat them, right? And because they are stiff and sturdy, they don't actually wilt, right? When they are when there's a water stress. Um, so they are well adapted to grow and survive and stay active on dry, moisture-deprived soil, right? They can continue photosynthesis during hot, warm periods during the growing season, although they don't really have access to water because these plant bodies can store water from the winter. Fire happens, but not very frequently, infrequently, between 30 to 40 years, right? But that infrequent fire is extremely important to maintain the biome, right? So when the fire happens, the above ground vegetation gets completely destroyed, but the underground, below ground vegetation survives, right? Below ground parts of the vegetation, root systems, storage organs survive, which collectively help these plants to resprout after this infrequent fire, right? And actually, some of the seeds produced by these plants require fire to germinate, right? And in fact, seed germination is faster with fire than without fire. Um, just to explain this particular image, it kind of shows the asynchrony. Look at the temperature. Temperature peak is in um, in June, July, August, right? But during the same time, there's a huge moisture deprivation, right? Moisture peak is, right over here, there's one peak, but the biggest peak is towards the winter, right? But during that time, it's quite cold. So this is actually what I meant by this climatic growth season mismatch. The better term is asynchrony or growth asynchrony. Um, Temperate scrublands and woodlands are actually quite pretty, right? So you're looking at the South African one in this image, the Californian chaparrals in the image below, right? Chilean mountain environments over here, right? And these are a few examples for those sturdy, hardy, sclerophyllous leaves you find in these Mediterranean biomes. Plant diversity in Mediterranean biomes are exceptionally rich, exceptionally diverse. The actual reason for that is not well understood. There are many historical events that may have driven that, and in some literature they argue it is actually the differences in soil characteristics, microtopographic variations that results in this high diversity, and certain arguments make it something to do with the interspecific competition that actually then resulted in niche segregation. I am not going to go into detail of what drove high biodiversity in temperate woodlands and scrublands. I'm not going to talk about the Mediterranean diversity. It's a completely different topic, although it is interesting to know. So, what brings forth by this rich floristic diversity? Well, when the plant diversity is high, it also leads to a greater diversity of animal lives, right? So the bird diversity and the small mammal diversity in Mediterranean environments are, quite high. Now let's move into another biome, temperate deciduous forests, right? So I earlier mentioned about one type of biome that is quite near and dear to me, right? And now actually I'm going to talk about another temperate biome, a second type of temperate biome that I can speak to the same. So actually, you know what? I'm going to continue the rest of the temperate deciduous forest as a second part. I am going to terminate the first part of the biome at this particular point, and we'll continue on with the temperate deciduous forests in the next part of the same lecture.